Why don't we jump right into it? So I'm here to talk about optimizing engagement and alliance in youth evidence-based practice, youth psychotherapy. Just as a brief introduction, I'm up at Rutgers, which is in Jersey. This is just a kind of context for where I am. I don't suspect that you'll be sending me any referrals anytime soon up there, but in case you have any need to get in touch with us, this is some information. I also like to just highlight some very useful websites that can extend your learning past today, which is useful for learning making use of the resources that people in this group have made available online. It's been highlighted before, but AffectiveChildTherapy.com and ABCT work together to provide a lot of online therapist resources. I want to also acknowledge a number of collaborators, funding, and other soldiers who do all of the thankless work and make all this possible, and so I want to just acknowledge them up front. When I was asked to present, John gave me a small order to give a summative review of alliance and engagement in youth psychotherapy. And I took that kind of request and thought, well, this one might be interesting. I figured it's been a while since I've sat down with the literature. This might be a nice opportunity to kind of review what's been going on. And when I sat down and started doing an updated search, what I found was something like this. What you see in this graph are the number of articles published per year when I put in the search word alliance and a couple of other related terms. Now, that's not a cumulative graph. That's not saying that over the course of time, 450 articles have been written. That's a graph of how many articles are written per year. So per year, the number of articles written or published in Alliance has been increasing year by year with small dips somewhere in the early 2000s, so that in the last year, in 2014 alone, about 480 articles were published on the topic of Alliance. So that's just about 460 articles more than I read in any given year. If I put in terms like engagement, participation, and things like that, certainly less dramatic, but still chugging along in that there's a solid interest year by year. And just as a point of comparison, I also want to search for trends in another area of research that I'm interested in, which is diagnostic research and treatments. And even though a number of people have referred to this new movement in therapy and clinical science as the revolution of clinical science, we see that it's still very much dwarfed by the interest in Alliance. And these are just the evidence of the amount of interest to publish. The audience for those who are reading it is presumably much larger than that. So what I'm going to try to do, so that was both daunting and relieving when I saw this graphed out. Daunting because I thought there's no way that I could provide a summative overview of the work that's done in kind of process research in the alliance and engagement. And then a little bit relieving because I thought, oh, there's no way that I could provide a summative overview of the research in just an hour and with my meager resources and attention span. So instead, what I thought I'd try to focus us in on are a couple key points because I would imagine that these are the points that might be most interesting to this audience and those broader out. First, we'll just cover a couple of definitions, distinguishing what's alliance, participation, and other related constructs. Then I want to talk about what are the outcomes that we know are predicted by things like alliance and engagement. We'll move on to patterns and trajectories of alliance and engagement over the course of therapy. And importantly, what are the predictors of good and worrisome alliance? What do we know about how to optimize? And I assume that that's really what's the most interesting to us is what can we do as therapists that can really help us? It got me thinking, why is there so much interest in this? And I think it's because of that ongoing interest in figuring out what can we do to make our work better. So as the evidence-based practice evolution has occurred, we've been given a lot of techniques, a lot of practices, a lot of principles to follow, but we also have this interest in knowing how do we build on the fundamentals of that interpersonal relationship, because at the heart of it, any therapy that we do is an interpersonal relationship. So how can we optimize, how can we maximize that relationship, right? Some people have referred to it as kind of like a dance, right, where the individual parts of the process sum together to be greater than the whole, right? We might not want to necessarily be that close to our clients, but the idea of having this sort of kind of coordinated effort of my movements match with your movements and that we're working together towards a common goal is nicely paralleled by this analogy. And all we're hoping to do, and a lot of times when we walk into that session, is just making sure we don't end up making a fatal mistake, right? And even though the idea of the therapy process, the dance, is somewhat kind of mystical to us, there are steps, right, that we can learn. There are ways that we can break down the elements of how do we show that we understand, that we care, that we're motivated to help the client, and how do we elicit that from our clients. And that's what this research that is being represented by those large number of publications is attempting to do, is trying to break down this often mysterious process like the alliance or client engagement into understandable components so that we can all start to learn what those steps might be. Of course, if you've had a supervision with me and you're a sci-fi kind of nerd like myself, you might have heard me explain it more like the matrix, right? That the idea of the matrix is really to kind of understand see both the world, the real world out there, as well as the code behind the world, so that simultaneously you're able to see the world around you, but also understand what are the components that you're trying to work with as you're going, so that you see both levels, right? So that hopefully that as you're doing therapy, we can help you work in like bullet time in the therapy world, okay? So some basic definitions first. So the topic that we're covering today is filled in by a number of different related constructs. You've heard these constructs referred to as the alliance, therapeutic alliance, the relationship, working alliance, therapeutic bond, helping alliance, treatment involvement, and they all refer to some of the same aspects of a similar construct. And here I'll just boil it down to the alliance for this part, which has been defined by Borden early on as being comprised of three main components. One is that affective bond, and when people just think of the alliance in shorthand, that's probably what they're mostly thinking about, which is that affective relationship where you feel understood and where the client feels valued and listened to, and where the therapist is showing empathy and unconditional regard. So that aspect of the alliance is well understood. But there are two other components that aren't often as thought about, and that's the agreement and involvement in tasks and the agreement in intermediate and overall goals. So that in addition to just feeling understood, welcomed and supported in the therapy session, you also are looking for ways to make sure that the client is in agreement with the activities that you are participating in the therapy session, whether that's lying on the couch or whether that's teaching cognitive restructuring or whether that's engaging them in exposure activities, the level to which the client agrees that these tasks make sense for what we're trying to do here. That's what we're trying to get to when we're talking about task agreement, as well as the overall goals should make sense for the client too. So if the goal for the therapist is to help this client gain insight, but the client really just wants to learn how to do their homework more efficiently, then being at odds like that can lead to disagreements and disruptions in the progress towards the therapy, to the extent that even though both goals are understandable and reasonable, that misalignment might lead to different kinds of ruptures. Okay? This is to be slightly distinguished from engagement, right, which has been described in the literature to refer to more kind of active participation. It's been used to describe emotional involvement as well as behavioral involvement, and mostly in the adult literature we'll see examples of emotional involvement, the amount that someone is willing to self-disclose, the amount that someone is willing to emotionally invest in the activities and the relationship of the therapy, whereas behavioral engagement looks at how much the client is really showing an interest, being active, taking in the lessons that the therapist is trying to teach, and demonstrating that they understand, that they're engaged, that they're interested in it. Another level of treatment engagement that we could be looking at, which I'll be de-emphasizing a little bit, which are things like pre-treatment barriers, access barriers, and also treatment-related engagement indices like homework and attendance. While these things are very valuable, I think I wanted to focus on some of the things that we had more control of in sessions, such that even though things like childcare and transportation to sessions are some of the best predictors of whether someone can make use of therapy, it's not something that we always have a lot of control over. So I wanted to just focus in this limited time on the things that we might interpersonally have some sort of influence over. I also want to just highlight that when you're thinking about the relationship and alliance, that there are a number of different conceptualizations that you might have that reflect your treatment model. And so more than trying to prescribe or restrict our way of thinking, I want everyone to be more mindful about how they're thinking about the relationship and how that interacts with our treatment model overall. So for example, in therapies like CBT, the common conceptualization of things like engagement, the alliance, we think of it much as kind of a necessary but not sufficient condition under which therapy can have positive effects, right? You might think of it as a moderator of treatment success. So in fact, you need a positive alliance, you need good engagement in order for the client to make most of the lessons that you're trying to teach, but it's not necessarily the critical mechanism that will explain whether or not a child gets better by the end of therapy, okay? That's to be distinguished from other more traditional therapies like client-centered therapy, where the alliance and the relationship is the main mechanism through which you would expect change. So to the extent that you can create a corrective experience with this client, that will be a learning experience, and they will start to show more functional behaviors because of that. Again, what this is meant to do is to really make you more aware of the code behind the interactions, right, so that you're becoming aware, how am I thinking of this relationship now? And it can be used as a way to then gain more control in how you use it, right? Do I want to add in a game here as a way to just promote their interest and activity level so that then we can get into some cognitive restructuring? Or do I need to make sure that I'm attending to how well they're responding to me so that their re-experiencing of our relationship is going to lead to better functioning, right? So just have that in the back of your mind as you're going into each session, thinking about the specific techniques that you want to implement in that session, and also as you're interpreting the research that I'm about to present, right? It's all very much embedded in that overarching kind of theory. But of course, even these simple models can be expanded further when we're thinking about it, and this is where it starts to get a little bit complex, right? This is why we think of alliance and other process variables as very mysterious, is because you can continue to break them down in multiple ways and at different, more specific levels. So if you take a simple example of a, say, a model of exposure treatment trying to treat something like anxiety, you might just say, well, we expect the exposure treatment to improve anxiety by reducing anxiety, increasing function, and depending on your particular read of the evidence today, some sort of level of habituation. And that's going to occur by changing these psychological behavioral mediators, right? The exposure treatment will improve your functioning by the degree to which you develop cognitive or behavioral coping or increase your distress tolerance, right? This is where the mediator, the important mechanism for exposure treatment, comes into play. But of course, that broad category of exposure treatment can be broken down into multiple processes as well. That can be explained as the degree to which a therapist is willing to push a client in an exposure, and that's interacting with the youth's willingness to stay in exposure, how much they're going to escape or avoid. And the alliance can play, and engagement can play multiple roles, right? It could play a mediating role of that micro-process in a session-to-session basis. It could moderate it, right? So if you're thinking that, well, what we want to do is ensure that there's engagement prior to getting into exposure, you might not think that this is an important mediator of our process, but that you need to make sure that you ensure that before you get in. And there are also a number of other ways that you can conceptualize this engagement and alliance, right? It could be some sort of moderator or mediator for how the treatment impacts some other important mechanism of change. And it also can have a direct impact on your ultimate outcome that you're concerned about. And the reason why I just put this out, again, is just to increase the mindfulness about which you're going into your therapy sessions. That I don't expect that you would go in thinking, okay, today I'm going to tinker with how I listen to my client, and then make sure that they're listening and showing me that evidence that they've heard me before I introduce the exposure exercise for today. However, I would want you to have that kind of basic principles in mind as you're thinking, what are the important variables that I might see either benefit our use of exposure today or interfere with it? And having a sort of version of this in your mind will help you become more consistent, planful, and purposeful in your own therapy work, is my belief. So what's the evidence for any of these things? So this is a lot of fancy diagrams. I hope that that's at least giving you the, reflecting the complexity which you feel when you go into sessions. What's the evidence for any of these kind of relationships existing? Well, first we want to look at, and I think this is where the evidence base comes into play, we want to see, does the alliance or engagement even matter at all, right? So before we go and really dissect it, let's make sure it has some sort of impact. And for this, we could go to individual studies, but it's useful since there's enough research there that we go to meta-analyses, and there have been a couple of nice ones done in the recent past. So Mark Carver and colleagues really did a comprehensive view of a number of different youth treatment studies, so across diagnostic categories, across different kinds of treatments, and not just behavioral. And looked at a diversity of relationship constructs. So this included alliance, but also included things like therapist relationship, included things like engagement. And what they found was that the overall weighted effect size, right, taking into account a couple of different variables, was 0.26. Now, just as a reminder of how to interpret these things, right, most of the original research that fed into this meta-analysis were correlational, and so when you're looking at say, correlations or R's, you would want to interpret that as like a 0.1 equals a small effect, a 0.3 equals a medium effect, and a 0.5 equals a large effect, right? And so this 0.26 would reflect somewhere between a small and a medium effect, right, getting close to that medium effect. And if you want another interpretation of that, if you were to use it as an extension for comparing two different treatments, a medium effect might mean that that person who's getting treatment compared to someone who's getting like a control condition, about 68 or 69% of those kids would get better compared to the control condition, right? So it shows that it's an above average improvement by having this be good, right? So to the extent that you're really focusing on the alliance, then you can show some sort of impact on the treatment outcomes that you're interested in. And what was nice about it is that they did also break it down to different kinds of construct. So we can see that there's a little bit of variation, right? So technically, the therapeutic alliance had an effect size of 0.21, right? So somewhere, again, between a small and medium. And things like the therapeutic relationship had a little bit higher. Things that focus on more behavioral participation and willingness also had this small to medium effect, right? And what was interesting is the comparison, they had other variables like therapist direct influence, like active structuring, looked pretty high, like in a medium range. But compared to parent participation and therapeutic relation with parents, these were fairly small. So at least in this analysis, we're seeing that maybe the effect of the direct relationship with the therapist and child may have more impact than the relationship between the therapist and the parents. This was supported by a specific review in anxiety and found that there was good initial evidence for positive effects of relationship affecting outcomes, but particularly in child involvement rather than parent involvement. In alliance-specific meta-analyses, we have two major examples that really give us a lot of information about how alliances can be used as a useful evidence-based technique. One, the original by Shirk and Carver, was the first to collect studies that looked at the alliance in child-based therapies. And what we find is that's still that same consistent but small effect size. And then Bryce McLeod did a more updated version that had slightly different inclusion criteria, a little bit more constrictive on the methodological rigor, and found a even smaller effect size of 0.14. He didn't find a big difference between the parent and child alliance there, but what was noticeable and what they comment on was the difference in the overall effect size, which was a little bit smaller. But together what we're seeing is that there's a consistent, at least, if small to possibly medium effect between how you attend to the relationship factors, engagement, and the ultimate outcome that you can have in a particular treatment, all right? Now, we're not just, one of the flaws in much of this research is that they're looking at broad-based relationships, correlations, and in these meta-analyses, they've often included trials where the alliance was measured at the same time as the outcome. Now, one of the problems of doing that is that it's hard to tease apart which comes first, right? the conception is that, well, you really work on the alliance, you develop a solid relationship, and then your improvement in treatment follows. But it could be just as likely and plausible, excuse me, that as you're getting into treatment and the client is experiencing a lot of benefit, that they would start to bond more with you, they would start to agree with the tasks that you're doing in therapy, they would start to agree with the goals more. So it could be a bi-directional effect, right? So what we're mostly interested in is whatever process we're looking at, that to ensure that that process at some earlier time, like session 1, predicts a later outcome, and to be mindful and aware of when that outcome instead is predicting the process. So what do we have in terms of information regarding this? We had some preliminary analyses that don't quite nail that relationship down, but gives us some hints. Angela Chu, and it's not a typo, there's yet another Chu who's studying alliance in CBT for anxiety. But we have worked together, and so she's conducted this study where in her analysis, she broke down the measurement of alliance into early phases and later phases, and what she found was that early alliance did predict mid-treatment anxiety outcomes, but that early alliance did not predict post-treatment outcomes. But what she did find was that alliance shifts, meaning the change between early levels of alliance and then mid-treatment levels of alliance did predict post-treatment outcomes. And so even though that's not a direct test of directionality, what it does suggest is that as alliance is changing and improving, what you can do is see that that has an effect on the ultimate outcomes that you're interested in. Same with the work that I did with Phil Kendall in looking at client involvement, which we'll talk about more later, looking at the behavioral participation that a child displays in session. That what we found was the most indicative of later outcomes is really what we called involvement shifts. So the same thing, looking at how much the child demonstrates increased engagement over the course of therapy as a predictor for how they're going to appear at the post-treatment outcomes, right? So that's all very leads us down the road of thinking, well, you know, we can see changes in the process prior to outcome, but that's not a direct test. And so we're interested in more direct tests. And so Marker and colleagues, including John here, did a really nice direct test of this, which was looking at reciprocal relations between alliance and outcome, where they took youth who had participated in a CBT trial, receiving either individual CBT or, family CBT or family education and support. So they included multiple theoretically oriented treatments in the same data set. And they collected weekly child therapist, parent, child therapist and parent report of both the therapeutic relationship as well as weekly anxiety symptom outcomes represented by the state. And they used the latent difference growth modeling to get an idea about which one of these kind of relationships was more prominent. So their analysis looks something like this. And before you get nervous, what this is trying to do is basically show you, these are the steps of the dance that I was hoping that we would be wanting to learn, right? So even though it feels like the alliance is something you couldn't break down, this is exactly like the same kind of dance steps where what you're looking at is alliance being measured across every different session throughout therapy. And you can kind of ignore the difference between these things. That's just a representation of alliance being measured across every different session. And the same with your anxiety measure, being measured at every different session as you go throughout therapy. And what you're really interested in is seeing, well, if I have alliance improving or decreasing from session 1 to session 2, I want to be able to capture that. And if I have anxiety that's increasing or decreasing from session 1 to session 2, I want to capture that. And then I can use those to see which one's coming first. Is alliance change preceding our anxiety outcomes, or is it the other way around? Okay. So using very advanced statistics, you can get a little window into that dance that we're talking about in terms of the alliance. And what they found was it was a little bit of both. Okay, and this may or may not surprise you, but what we saw was that greater alliance change by some reporters, the mother and the therapist, but not the father or the child, did precede and predict reduced anxiety change. Okay. But at least by the child's report, we saw the opposite relationship as well, that reduced anxiety, how much the child was improving for other reasons as well, i.e. the active treatment, also predicted how much they were experiencing value from the alliance. And what was interesting was that no relations from the child's report of alliance were found. So what that means, we're not sure, but what we can at least gather is that it's important to have multiple different views on how the relationship between the therapist and child is developing, and that some of that can be useful in terms of indicating who's getting better and how we can change things if we notice that there are early signs of poor process that we would want to intervene with earlier. Okay. So as a interim summary here, what we've seen so far is that alliance and engagement are fairly well-studied constructs. The alliance has a small to moderate but consistent relationship with outcomes, and that we do have at least initial evidence, although it's preliminary, that there is some reciprocal relationship between alliance and outcomes, where alliance predicts later outcomes and change in anxiety improvement, it does lead to improved alliance as well. So then we have to start thinking about what's next. So great, something worth paying attention to. If alliance is important to therapy, then how do we anticipate problems, right? So if only we could predict bad alliance, right? So here's the little cartoon saying, there are only two things stopping you from being a good dancer, Mr. Jones, your feet, all right? And by the way, this is just a side note that, the internet is an amazing thing. At 6:30 in the morning this morning, I just simply Googled predicting bad dancers. And this is what I got up there. So, in days past, I'm sure you would have to send an RA down to the library and sort through years and years worth of New Yorker magazines before you'd find something like this. But this was able to be found in 30 seconds. But this is the kind of challenge to us as therapists is that it's nice to monitor change in alliance, and that's useful, right? Because then maybe we can be like, if we are so ambitious, we could be giving our clients an alliance measure each week, and we could even be charting that and saying, oh, who's going up, who's going down, who's being stable, and then that could give us an indication about, oh, they're not doing so well, I should try to do something about it, which we'll get to in a little bit. But it would also be nice to know, could I predict this even before it becomes a problem, right? Because we like to be kind of planful and anticipatory. So we can return to those meta-analyses to look for examples of what could predict poor alliance from the very get-go. So Shirk and Carver used moderator analysis to find which of these different variables might give us some worry about the alliance sometime in therapy. And they looked at things like age, they looked at the problem set that brought them into treatment, they looked at behavioral versus non-behavioral treatments, they looked at the format of the treatment, individual, parent, and family, they looked at manualized versus non-manualized therapy, and they looked at whether it made a difference if it was in a natural service setting versus research, right? And Bryce McLeod, when he did a more extensive review later, included many of the same kind of variables. And what we found was some consistency here, right? That between the two meta-analyses, what we found was that primary problem area that was a focus of treatment was a consistent predictor, right? So that in Shirk and Carver, we found that the relationship between alliance and outcomes in whatever study that it was included had an effect size of 0.30. Right, which is, meets our medium requirement, versus internalizing was only a small effect size, right? So how do you interpret that? Well, that's not to say that the alliance or engagement is not important in kids who come in for anxiety, depression, or whatnot. However, what it does suggest is that when you have a kid who comes in with a conduct oppositional problem, ADHD, that what you might need to be doing is paying more attention because the degree to which you establish a working relationship with that child may have more relative impact on the outcomes and how they uptake your interventions, a little bit more relative impact than it would be for a kid with internalizing problems, okay? So that's how you would kind of interpret that. And Bryce found the same thing down here where externalizing, kids who are coming in for externalizing problems had a larger relationship between alliance and outcome than the other types of problems. Now, Bryce did find a relation between child and adolescent versus Shirk and Carver did not, where those trials that focus on children under the age of 13 or so, it might be more important. And here, they did find a difference between those that were naturally treatment-seeking versus those that were recruited or mandated for a research study or mandated by the state, versus Shirk and Carver did not find that difference. Okay. So what this is suggesting is that also potentially when you're seeing these kids in naturalistic treatment centers, that's something where some of that early work in establishing a relationship, establishing goals, identifying, the reasons for motivation to stay in therapy. Those are particularly important in natural clinic settings. Right? There are also some methodological things that they found, which I will just skim past. Great. So we have some ideas of predictors of what happens, what could help us understand alliance outcome relationships at the beginning of treatment, right? Those are all kind of characteristics that you could determine at the beginning of treatment. But what happens over the course of therapy, right? Because as we're describing, just like a dance, the alliance and engagement are something that changes over the course of therapy. So in order to get a look at that, research has begun to map out processes across the course of therapy. And this would help give us clues about when and how alliance and other engagement and things like that are important, right? So Phil Kendall, along with John, did use the same data set as they had before with the reciprocal relations study, looking at weekly alliance ratings from therapist, child, mother, and father, and wanted to estimate or just kind of track out what the typical pattern of alliance was over the course of a CBT protocol and a education support, not control condition, but non-specific condition, right? To see if there was in fact differences across a very targeted CBT control condition and an education support condition, right? And with the hypothesis of thinking, we want to test out whether the presence or the start or the initiation of exposure exercises has any sort of measurable impact on the alliance as you go, right? And this is critical for us thinking in terms of how do we continue to incorporate evidence-based practice, particularly for anxiety, but also for depression and other kinds of disorders that might use exposures, is that there's fear out there, both from parents and some clinicians about thinking, how do I incorporate exposures, and could this in fact be something that would rupture the alliance somewhere down the road that would make them a trit? And what they found was that there wasn't evidence for any sort of alliance rupture, that if they mapped out the trajectories for alliance, whether it's in the family CBT condition, which is the dark line, or the education support condition, which is the gray line, that a similar pattern was found where they characterize it as a dual slope model where there was a sharp increase throughout the first half of therapy. And then at the midpoint of therapy where exposures typically start, there was a leveling off, but there was no decline in alliance. So they concluded that there was no evidence for an alliance rupture based on exposures, right? And what they concluded is that because of very high scores in general with the alliance, that was more explanatory for why the alliance leveled off midway through therapy, okay? So that kind of a study tells us something about how we feel comfortable with treatment. It tells us a little bit about the mechanism of treatment, that yes, we can expect alliance to be growing, and as previous research showed, is important for our CBT therapy to work. However, and we can feel comfortable that as we go through the process, it's not going to impact negatively the interpersonal relationship that we've developed. I and colleagues want to take that a step further with a different sample, but with the same treatment. Actually, it was an individual cognitive behavioral therapy rather than a family-based therapy. Want to look at both trajectories of that alliance and more directly evaluate whether or not an alliance rupture occurred. But we also want to look for predictors of those trajectories itself, right? So it's not just enough to know, oh, good, alliance basically increases over the first half and then levels off. We want to know, could we predict, are there individuals that we would worry about having particular problems with the alliance, right? So we assessed weekly therapist alliance scores, and because we were worried about burden on the kids, we only assessed child alliance every 4 sessions, and we wanted to test different kinds of trajectories very directly. And then we wanted to look at these various predictors as potential factors that might predict better or worse alliance trajectories. Youth demographics, pretreatment severity, the presence of school refusal, other early treatment variables like being prescribed an SSRI or medication, early attrition, and also their pre-treatment, how they present with their pre-treatment coping style. We thought that how the child's innate coping ability might influence how they take up the therapy. And so our hypotheses were, well, we want to look to see if the dual slope that Kendall and colleagues found, whether that was supported. We wanted to do a more direct test of alliance ruptures. So whereas you'll notice that when Phil did this analysis, they simply wanted to see if there was a change in slope at mid-treatment. We wanted to look at, we individually coded clients and looked at when did they start their particular initiation of exposure sessions, and we wanted to see, was there going to be a sharp break, right? Was there evidence for a sharp break of alliance before they would either continue or stabilize or go down? We also wanted to test the other theories of having some sort of other shape of trajectory, like a quadratic shape. And the reason why we tested for this, because in traditional therapies like psychodynamic, psychoanalytic therapy, there's a thought of that there's a necessary kind of rupture and repair pattern that you would see that as a therapist gets to know a client, they're going to start to get into some more difficult issues, and so that there might be some sort of conflict, and that would lead to alliance ruptures, but what would you hope for is that there would be a repair by the end of therapy. So we want to check for that using a quadratic model, which simply would look like kind of a U-shaped trajectory of exposure of alliance. What we found was most support for what Phil found as well, which is a dual slope model. You'll see from the therapist report that it looks fairly straight here. You'll see the break a little bit better on the next slide. But what I wanted to just highlight was that you can notice even though it's a fairly linear trend, there's so much individual variation, right? And so even though on average we find clients improving in alliance as they go through CBT for anxiety, there's good reason to be monitoring your individual clients because there could be meaningful individual patterns, right? But we still have to do some research on that to see if we can categorize individual patterns a little bit better. This was the results from the youth reported alliance. Again, we only had 4 different assessment points, and because of that low number of assessment points, I think we got evidence for no change. It's just like a flat line showing that alliance scores were relatively high for children, but they didn't change over the course of therapy. When we went to go look for predictors, we had some interesting findings. So this top left graph shows you analysis or the graphing of our dual slope model. Somewhat different from what Kendall and colleagues found was that even though there was a change in slope after the initiation of exposures, we didn't see as much of the leveling off that they found, so it continued to grow fairly high. But for kids who showed a higher level of depressive symptoms at intake, for those who were coming in with both anxiety and high level of depression symptoms, we found that at the start of exposures, they started to flatline. They started to bend flat. Right? Whereas those who were who showed low levels of depressive symptoms, they continued to show increasing alliance ratings throughout, right? Our interpretation of this is that this is kind of part and parcel of working with depressed kids, and that there might be more disengagement, it might be difficult to arouse a motivation, and so when you start exposures, they might be particularly difficult to get going, and so you'll want to be paying a lot of attention to that, right? When we looked at intake levels of anxiety symptoms, what we found was that the patterns were the same for these kids, but somewhat contrary to our hypotheses, those kids who scored higher in anxiety symptoms also showed higher alliance ratings throughout treatment, right? We interpret this as being that perhaps there was a little bit more motivation for coming into treatment and feeling more engaged in the process because they are actually noticing and self-reporting anxiety symptoms. And interestingly, consistent with our hypotheses, that those who came in with reporting a natural engagement style of coping, those who are more active problem solvers, those that were more naturally tended to embrace cognitive ways of thinking in terms of cognitive restructuring, also continued to show high levels of alliance throughout treatment, whereas those that didn't, who came in with low levels of engagement coping, tended to flatline out after the midpoint of treatment or after they started exposures. So the research there is starting to build that we are interested in understanding how alliance is changing over the course of therapy, and that we have some noticeable predictors. But another way to view this is not so much just overall scores, but really how much the differences in viewpoint matter. And so for us, we followed up on this by wanting to look at, could we measure a way in which therapists and children were not attuned with each other, right? Were they misattuned with what the other person was thinking? And so we looked at the difference between therapist report and child report on the alliance scales at each measurement point, and to look at, do bigger differences, how discrepant therapists and kids are at looking at the alliance relationship, how did that affect outcomes? What we found was that there were measurable differences in alliance in terms of how therapists and kids were rating. So what you're paying attention to is these two bars together with these together, and then these two bars separately. These are child ratings of alliance, and then therapist ratings of child alliance, and these are adolescent ratings of alliance, and these are therapist ratings of adolescent alliance. And the reason why they're split is because the two measures have different scales, and so we couldn't combine them together. But what you'll notice is that there is a significant difference between alliance as rated by children and therapists, and at the trend level, a difference between adolescents and therapists rate alliance. And that's true for session 4, at session 8, but not at session 12, so there's more of a convergence. Now, the first thing that I'll notice when you see this is that I think that there's a little bit of hope and encouragement knowing that the children themselves were the ones who were rating the alliance higher than the therapists. So that may or may not be typical for your client population, but that might also explain some of the findings that we found next, which that we did not find any form of discrepancy actually predicting outcomes. And so we thought that the people who would be furthest away from each other would show some sort of alliance rupture, and that would predict negative outcomes, and we didn't find that. So we used a interaction analysis to be able to determine, was there any difference between these conditions of where the youth rated alliance high and the therapist rated high, versus youth rating low and the therapist high, versus the youth rating high and the therapist low, and the youth rating low and the therapist low. And none of those conditions ended up predicting post-treatment anxiety. So on one hand, it didn't support our hypotheses, but on the other hand, what we can suggest is that when alliance ratings are generally high, the differences in perspective may not be so catastrophic. And so that gives us some encouragement that the perspectives, we don't have to be so worried about always being attuned with the kids at each moment in time. Of course, this is in the context of having youth who are rating alliance fairly high. So as another interim summary, what we seem to have is reliable predictors, externalizing versus internalizing, recruitment source, timing of assessment, et cetera. Trajectory analysis supports a dual slope model that continues to grow or stable after exposures, and that we know something about predictors of trajectories, that we want to be more mindful of kids who come in with depression or high anxiety symptoms. And that there's a reliable difference between reporters seeing the same thing, but that might not be as much of a cause for concern. Okay. So where are we now? Well, so we started to learn some things, but are we really, what's the next step in terms of what we need to learn? So this is kind of the first insight. I get a sense that there's something to this alliance thing. Here's Neo again, first knowing I know Kung Fu. It's all kind of a sudden kind of enlightenment, but we want to take the next step of thinking, how do we optimize? Now that we're knowing how to predict some kids who might do worse, we know the general pattern of alliance, what can we do to improve things? So we return to our complex model, and we want to start thinking about how can we unpack this aspect. A lot of what we've been looking at is what is predicting or what is moderating the alliance and engagement as it predicts outcome. But can we instead look for ways to actually improve alliance and engagement to increase outcome at the end, right? So this last section will focus on alliance and engagement building activities. One nice study by Tori Creed and Phil Kendall focused on, again, CBT for anxious youth, coded 11 different behaviors, and what they found was that collaboration, as you would expect, the degree to which kids and therapists, or the degree to which a therapist fully went out of their way to make sure that the child was on board and making sure that the goals matched the child's interests, that predicted higher child alliance. But interestingly, these other three variables predicted lower child alliance. That included pushing the child to talk too soon or being too formal, and that seemed to be what we'd expect. But also kind of a counterintuitive finding of common ground, the degree to which a therapist was trying to seek common ground by saying, oh, no, I like basketball too, or I can do this too, seemed to predict also lower child alliance later on, and they suspected that it might have come across as trying too hard. So on one hand, collaboration is really important as a way to build engagement and alliance, but on the other hand, if you come across as forcing the relationship too much, that can also be a negative predictor. Nathaniel Youngbloth and Steve Shirk did a similar kind of study where they were looking at depressed kids who were receiving CBT. They coded 10 different therapist behaviors, controlling for initial resistance, and what they found were things like exploring the teen motivation, much like collaboration, would predict later child-client involvement, and less structure would also predict client involvement. So maybe engaging your child and figuring out what are the ways in which they can participate and have some sort of influence into the session was predictive of better involvement later on. I'm going to skip over this. So the next series of studies, I think, is best portrayed in pictures, because this is where it starts to get a little complicated, thinking about what can we do as a way to improve involvement or alliance. These are three different studies, Carver, Shirk, and all, with a small sample of adolescents receiving depression in a hospital setting or ER setting. The second one is Shirk and other colleagues, also with depressed adolescents receiving CBT in schools, and then one by Phil and I, looking at CBT in a research clinic. And the Carver study first hypothesized, one, how do our therapist strategies in session 1 and 2 predict alliance in session 3, predicting later client involvement, and ultimately predicting outcome, right? So this is the kind of research that we're looking at in terms of how do we start to unpack which steps we can take in order to improve subsequent important process and then have an impact on ultimate outcome. And what they found was that one therapist strategy, the therapist lapses, meaning how much that they were coded after observing therapy sessions, how much they were coded as not paying attention, maybe not showing that they've heard what the client says, not reflecting on important things that the child has, that negatively predicts alliance, as you would expect, but neither of the other variables that they were looking at, like socialization and rapport, had any sort of impact on alliance. That increase in alliance did improve later clients' engagement in the session, but what we found is that overall, neither of those, alliance nor client involvement, really predicted 3 or 6 month follow-ups. Now they did find, it wasn't statistically significant, but they see kind of like a descriptive difference between kids who participate in CBT versus those that participated in non-specific therapy. And so that it seems, at least at a trend level, that greater engagement and alliance might be more helpful in predicting outcome than in the non-specific therapy. Shirk et al. In their depressed sample with schools, we're looking at this kind of model. At session 3, if you were looking at therapists and youth alliance, how much did that predict participation? Here measured as number of sessions. And how much did that ultimately predict outcome in terms of BDI and diagnosis? What they found was that therapist alliance predicted the degree to which the therapist was doing all those things of affective bond and goals and task agreement, increased the number of sessions that the client was willing to participate in, but youth alliance, their rating, did not predict that. And there was a relative lack of impact on treatment outcome, but youth alliance did seem to. So we don't, so even though youth alliance was not impacting their participation, there seemed to be some form of impact on ultimate outcome. In our own model that we are looking at, we are interested in what could the therapist do, in fact, to increase engagement that would then have some sort of impact on treatment outcomes? So we were looking at, if we measured a child's level of involvement early in therapy, and we were looking at some way to gather how the therapist would react so that they could increase involvement, how would that impact outcome? And this calls to defining a new term, which is therapist flexibility, which broadly we had defined as therapist adaptations of a treatment approach, or a manual, which we were using, designed to fit the needs, interests, or abilities of a child, right? So we were interested in looking at how much the therapist actively uses the content that they were hearing in the sessions and really breathing life into the treatment protocol, right? And that can include content flexibility, like using examples, using their own life personal examples, connecting different events and situations that the child had mentioned in earlier sessions to make points later in session and later in therapy. And also structural flexibility. So even though we were looking at this in the context of a manual-based treatment, we were looking at how much do they change up the different activities in order to breathe life in it, to make it more active, more engaging, more interesting, as well as to fit needs when the child needed it. For children who, say, for example, were presenting with ADHD, how much were they structuring the treatment to be able to break things down and make it more manageable for them? Okay? Here are some examples of that. Just as a kind of clinical example, just recently, I was giving supervision to a student who had intended to go into a session, planning to focus in on teaching cognitive restructuring and problem solving. And she was all set to go in and do that, which is a typical kind of experience when you're working with a novice clinician, working with a treatment manual. They plan really well, and then they go in. And the client came in. This was a teenage boy, and he was kind of despondent and semi-unresponsive to the client's engagement, right? So he would sit there with his coat over his head, and anytime that she tried to teach him something, he would not talk. And they would go for a walk, which was a nice form of responsiveness, let him kind of get out of that kind of a constrained environment, come back, and then she would start to ask again, and he would again put that coat over his head. They go for another walk. She finally got him to come back and reveal why he was so upset. And he said, well, my mom and I just got into a fight on the way over here. She promised me that if I did this homework that I would get her phone to use and call my girlfriend. But she didn't bring the phone because she didn't think I was going to finish the homework. So she really went back on this bargain. And so now I'm really pissed off. To which the therapist said, oh my goodness, what do I do with this? I was planning on doing cognitive restructuring and problem solving. And this doesn't seem to fit that at all. So I guess I'm going to have to do some sort of family parent session and go and bring them in. And she actually did a really nice change around where she went and brought the mom in. And she basically helped them with communication analysis and talking about expressing themselves, et cetera. And that was all fine. And the only thing I objected to, and that might be a nice example of structural flexibility, right? Changing up the task in order to get to what, in order to highlight a particular objective, though I'll say in a second how that could be more tightly focused. But what I objected to was her thinking that she could not have used cognitive restructuring or problem solving in that situation, right? So she could have just as easily chosen to say, wow, that seems like a really rough situation. It sounds like you're really upset with your mom. I'm wondering, what are the thoughts that are going through your head as you're thinking about how your mom kind of went back on her kind of end of the bargain? Have him discuss all the thoughts about how she really doesn't care about him or that she doesn't treat him respectfully, look through the thinking traps, try to identify them, try to challenge them, look for more realistic ways of thinking about it. That could have been a legitimate way to go. Another way to go would be to use problem solving. Wow, that sounds like a really difficult problem that you have going on with your mom. It sounds like she went back on her end of the bargain. I wonder how we could probably brainstorm some ways that you could address this problem, to kind of maybe repair this conflict with your mom, and brainstorm in different ways like, well, I guess I could talk to her. Okay, that's great. What's another way? Well, I can just go out and yell at her and tell her she's a bad mom. Okay, that's another possibility. What are some other ways? I can write her a note. I could get my dad into this. Okay, great. Well, let's go through the pros and cons of each of those solutions. And why don't we now invite your mom in and try to kind of see which ones work on your mom, great? So she could have ended up having a parent-child session even after focusing on one of these skills, so she would have had the dual benefit of focusing, like teaching the skill in a real-life situation where it was relevant to the child, and then also making use of all the other kind of instinctual things that she wanted to accomplish, which was actually having the parent and child talk directly. So that's an example of both kind of functional or structural and content flexibility, which we're always seeking to improve on our use of. So my thinking was that I would hope that we would, as therapists, be using that kind of responsiveness, that level of flexibility in response to kids who were demonstrating low levels of engagement early on in therapy, right? So if a kid was coming into our sessions and they were flat, they were uninvested, they were unmotivated, that therapists then would respond with more responsive, more creativity, more connecting, and that would then increase later involvement. What we found was somewhat the opposite. A therapist's use of flexibility in that way did predict later involvement, so these are just basic correlations, and early involvement predicted later involvement, and I think we could anticipate that. But early involvement and therapist flexibility were actually related in the positive direction, which was opposite of what I was hoping for. I would expect it to be in the negative direction, right? That as early involvement was down, that you'd have increased therapist flexibility. So it was exactly the opposite. Now, if we just look out past what these things mean, therapist flexibility itself didn't have any direct impact on outcome, but later involvement did have a significant impact on whether or not the child showed diagnostic improvement at post-treatment as well as decreased diagnostic severity. So later involvement is important. Therapist flexibility can increase client engagement, but what we're missing is this part. And even in particular, when I looked at a potential moderator effect here, where I split the sample into lower half of early involvement and higher half of early involvement, I found exactly what we were kind of fearing, which is that when kids come in the upper half of early engagement, therapists are significantly responding with increased responsiveness and engagement, which is improving later engagement. But when kids are coming with very low engagement, therapists are not really responding to them very much at all. And these weren't, the formal moderated mediation test did not prove significant, but at least descriptively, and I assume that that's actually mostly a power issue, but descriptively what we're seeing is that maybe therapists are missing an opportunity to respond to a critical process that's in front of their face. And we understand how this happens, right? Those kids that come into our offices that are into it, that are engaged, we kind of match them and we're like, okay, yeah, let's do that, we can do more. And it kind of stews up additional ideas. Those kids that come in a little bit flatter, disengage. At first, we might kind of really try to rally our energy, but after a while, they come session after session, not very engaged. We start to slow down as well. And so what I'm taking away from this study is that we should caution ourselves from that process, and that those are the moments that we really need to find some way to continue to be using our responsiveness and engagement techniques at that point. All right? So that's kind of summarized there. Just for interest of time, I'm going to really skip past this study, which we just completed along with Jenny Hudson and Phil Kendall, and looking at a number of these different factors together, because the findings, in truth, were a little bit difficult to interpret consistently with the other ones. But essentially what we were looking for was alliance, involvement, and flexibility all in the same set of data. And we found some interesting findings that alliance, both by the child and therapist alliance, were kind of flat or decreasing, and child involvement was increasing over time, which is different from what I had found, and that therapist flexibility was flat themselves. But what we did find is that there was some level of predictability across alliance and involvement in some measures of outcome, but not very consistently, that these things can be important for treatment outcome, like I highlighted in the moderated mediator model as well. Okay, great. So our summary conclusions. First, alliance and outcomes seem to have consistent small to medium effects. That's good, so that tells us that we should probably care about it. That we do have some idea about what would predict whether a child presents with low or high alliance from the get-go. And that we also have some idea about what could be useful in terms of fostering alliance and engagement over the course of therapy. So the good stuff are things like collaboration, exploring motivation, less structure. The bad things might be trying too hard, pushing too soon, being too formal. Lapses in skill, like listening and attending, can be predictive. more so than some of the more positive therapist skills like rapport building and socialization. And for me, I want to encourage that we pay attention to those early client indicators of disengagement and use it as a rallying cry for us to become more responsive. So that eventually we can get to that point of where we're both seeing the whole matrix and gaining control over what we can see and act on in therapy, as well as having our goals on the ultimate prize. So in the end, I just want to conclude with rethinking how this fits into what we're interested in terms of therapy. And I call upon the old adage from Kiesler in which he described that what's important for us in doing psychological research is understanding what treatment by whom is most effective for this individual with that specific problem under which set of circumstances. And I just want to add in one additional component to look at is that what treatment by whom, in what way, is most effective for this individual with what specific problem, et cetera. Okay. And future directions would be to continue research knowing that alliance and involvement are related but not the same, that there are meaningful predictors, and so we want to remember that the relative importance of alliance or engagement might depend on what kind of problems the child is presenting with, the kind of the setting and the nature about how they were referred, and that we want to also take a look at individual trajectories of engagement and alliance, because what we know is that there are good predictable patterns and we can predict those patterns, but what we haven't done, and you saw from that slide, that spaghetti diagram where you had all those individual different trajectories, there's a lot of different individual trajectories that we could find additional patterns that might be meaningful in terms of our ability to identify problems and to interact with them early on. So that hopefully that our dance can be beautiful and elegant, and that we feel more confident and composed as with our dance partner. So I want to thank you, and happy to take any questions if we have time.